Weprin, who is one of our co-executive directors. But I always want to come to this event, partly because it brings me back to when I went to graduate school before I became a lawyer. And I went to graduate school to get a PhD in literature, thinking that my life could continue to just be about reading books. And then somebody said, well, do you know where the tenure is going to be in 7 years? Is it going to be in American, or is it going to be in Jane Austen, or is it going to be in London? And I thought, well, this is about getting a job. And then it kind of destroyed the myth. But when I get to sit in with the jury and listen to them and watch them deliberate and hear them once again talk about translation and the meaning of words, and how do you take a word in one language that has real punch and meaning and find the word that carries you in the other language, you just are transported for a brief moment into a very special world, and one that I think sort of is what makes us civilized. And these days, that's a more important thing than ever. So I just want to say first, thank you to our jurors. Thank you to our audience. I want to thank Paul Leclerc, who's here, who's eminent in his own right. And also, obviously, to our award winners. This is a big deal for us. We are lucky to be endowed for this, so it should continue on in the future. And I literally just flew in from Paris, where they were doing their translation prize awards as well. So we're on both sides of the Atlantic. We live to make sure that the alliance that was formed almost 250 years ago to make this company exist stays strong in the face of what can be nasty government to government disputes. So thank you all for coming. Off to Jennifer Wilden-Webb. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. I'm Carolyn Waters. Bonsoir, bienvenue, welcome. I'm the director and head librarian here at the New York Society Library, and we are just delighted to be able to be the host site for the French American Foundation's Translation Prize. We are lovely to see everyone here. And for those of you who may be here for the first time, I just want to briefly say, again, welcome. And I hope that we will see you again here, either as a member or as a visitor at one of our other events. We are the oldest library and cultural institution in New York City, founded in 1754. And we are open to all. We're an independent membership library. We're open to all. We have 300,000 books in our glorious open stacks, many French books, many, many more in translation. We have a lovely children's library, beautiful reading and writing spaces like the room that you're in right now. And we host a full season of events and programs, author lectures, performances, and many reading seminars and webinars, things like that. So we hope that you will come back and visit us again. And that's all for me. I want to hand the podium over to Jennifer Wilden-Webb. Thank you.
Beautiful space for us to be here today, all of us together. Thank you for your hospitality. Your team is exceptional. So very grateful for all of that. One of my favorite things to do when I get up at a podium is to say thank you. They're all of us. I mean, thank you goes a long way, as we know. But first, I'd like to thank Ed, because he's another one of these events he has to attend as board chair of the French American Foundation. We have Mia here also, who's another board member, and all of our board in general are supporters of our programming. This organization will be celebrating its 50th anniversary next year. Also want to make a note to thank William Hurst, because he has supported this program as it's continuing to grow through the years, and that's really a very special connection to the organization that we have with him for that. The Florence School Foundation has funded us and gives us generous support to be able to do this every year. We've been doing this since 1986. That's really, what have you been doing since 1986? That's a lot of work. I want to mention before I forget, we have to thank Elizabeth McGee, my co-executive director. She cannot be here this evening. She with Gabby also launched this and got this beautiful program off the ground with our staff. And so please, a round of applause for Elizabeth and her. When she watches the recording, she'll know I didn't forget to thank her. So that's really good. Our jury, we could not have done this without the jury. I'm going to just take a moment. I'm not here to speak a lot, but you know, when I decided on the final jury selection for the final award winners this evening, we know that words matter, and it was just so interesting to hear us continue to go back to what were the factors went into the jury to make their decision to come up with the finalists, but then again to choose the award winners. So I'm just going to really quickly read through my notes on this. Accurately conveying the meaning and the sense of the original work, incorporating stylistic nuance, respecting the tone, the register, the metaphor of the translation of the words, awareness of the cultural nuances of the words that they're translating, also considering the level of difficulty of the translation, the wider and sort of the wider aim of the book, and promoting the work for it as well. The translation prize honors translation, not the original text, and that's always important to sort of check back on as we work through this process, because it's not judging the book in its original form, but the art and the science of the translation of it. And I think that's a really important. I'm sorry, I whizzed through it pretty quickly because I'm afraid you get mad at me for reading too much. But those are really important touch points. And I know our judges, when they come up here this evening, will the jury members will kind of reflect on some of that experience. To thank our jury, we have Nancy Naomi Carlson, we have Yasir El Hariri, Wyatt Mason, Matt Reed, Christine Reno. For 6 months, they worked with us on this program. Over 80 submissions they worked through together, read 10 finalist books, and then selected 2 winners, one in fiction and one in nonfiction. That's a lot of work. And the work matters. The work of all of the translators matter. This art is what connects us culturally, intellectually, bridges the ocean, bridges our countries. So thank you for all of that work that you've done for us. And we hope that you'll be a part of our juries as we move forward again. I'm going to mention, thank you, Paul Leclerc, please, for being here, their keynote speaker. What a treat to have you here for all of us this evening. And also our winners. So tonight for fiction, we will be speaking with and giving the award to Laser Liederhandler for the translation of The Hollow Beast. I believe that deserves some applause. Bernard and published by Biblioesis. In nonfiction, the winner, John Lambert, again, let's have some applause. The translation of B13 Chronicle of a Trial by Emmanuel Carrere, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. We're going to hear more about it, less from me and more from all of you about these important works and their translation of them. Christine, I'm going to call up now, if you don't mind. Christine will be introducing Paul. And just to give you a moment to learn about Christine. Christine Reno is Professor Emerita, French and Francophone Studies at Vassar College, where she taught a translation course. And I know you can share a little bit more about your wonderful accomplishments. She's published several translations of Middle and Modern French into English. We were so blessed to have you and all the jurors as part of our program this year. So please come up, and thank you very much, everyone. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. I'm very pleased to have the honor of introducing Paul Leclerc, who is our distinguished keynote speaker for this evening. Paul Leclerc holds the PhD from Columbia University, where he did his dissertation on Voltaire, dissertation that was granted distinction. He went on to a number of very prestigious teaching and administrative positions at Union College in Schenectady, and then in New York at CUNY Baruch, and then at Hunter College also, where he served as president. After his work at Hunter College, he went on to to direct the New York Public Library, where he distinguished himself not only by the longevity of this appointment, almost 18 years, but his insistence on being a hands-on CEO and organizing a number of exhibits that cross the Atlantic, some of them. He also, after that, served as the director of of the Reed Hall Columbia Global program in Paris. He has been awarded 11 honorary doctorates. He has served on a couple of dozen nonprofit boards. And he has also served on the President Clinton's board of the Committee on the Arts and Sciences, and at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the Conseil Scientifique. He is the author of some 5 volumes in the Voltaire Foundation series, and also co-editor or author, editor, co-editor. He is also co-editor of Books, Dirks, and Bites, libraries in the 21st century. He will be talking today on how English translations of French works of fiction changed his life.
Very much, Christine. You got a lot added.
There's more.
I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. It's an honor to have been asked to speak at this event. I've been given 7 minutes and not longer. So I'm going to set my watch to 7 minutes. That way you will be able to say, well, he gave a keynote address, but he was brief. There we go, 7 minutes. I'd like to talk to you this evening about what a number of French books did for me. But I'd like to begin really with a statement that Laser wrote that he has in our programs tonight, in which he says, a translation is a novel's reincarnation, carrying the original work across the boundaries of language, time, and geography. Couldn't be truer in general, and for me, very specifically, couldn't be truer, because I'm going to be talking about 4 books that I read 65 years ago that set me on a path that resulted in what you see and hear this evening, and the kind of career that Christine was kind enough to elaborate on. This is a very strange story, and it's so strange, it has to be true, because you couldn't make up something like this. So I grew up in a very, very, very religious family in Queens, in Bayside, Queens, but a family that had French-Canadian origins. And this was all before the Second Vatican Council that some of you will remember radically changed the Roman Catholic Church. But I went to Catholic schools for 16 years because we weren't allowed to go, in my family and in the circles that we moved in, we weren't allowed to go to secular schools. So that meant 8 years with nuns at grammar school, 4 years with brothers, Marist brothers, at a boys' high school in Flushing, and then 4 years with the Jesuits at Holy Cross. And it was a hermetically sealed and very, very tightly sealed bubble that I lived in. I had one great uncle who was a priest in Canada. I had 5 great aunts who were nuns in Canada. I had one aunt who was a nun in Canada as well. And I had 2 great aunts who lived and worked for my uncle running his house. He was the priest. So I was drenched in this religion and in persons with the religion that were an intimate part of my family, and so on and so forth. When I got to Holy Cross, I wasn't a French major. I should have been, but I wasn't. I was a pre-med major. And it took me a long time to realize that that was the wrong thing that I should be studying. So I started French, even though I had heard a lot of sort of dialect as a youngster My grandmother didn't speak English, she spoke only French. We didn't speak French to her. We spoke English, but we understood what she was saying. So I started learning French in a formal kind of way as an undergraduate at Holy Cross in September 1959. And I had the same Jesuit priest as my French instructor for 2 years. His name was Alfred Deshotel. Like me, he was of French Canadian origin, but he was first generation where I was second generation. And one day he did something that was extraordinarily shocking to me, but very seductive at the same time. And I'm not sure why he did this. And even though we became closer later on in life, I never really asked him what his motivation was. So he was on the dais like me. He was dressed as a Jesuit with a black soutane and a Roman collar. And he brought a copy of Candide with him in English. And he read a section from Candide that, like everything else in Candide, is wacky and offensive, but for some people funny at the same time. And so there's one episode in Candide where Candide and Saga Cacambo are in South America, and they're sort of in a savanna. And they hear the cries, the shrieking of women, and they look through the bushes and they see two naked women chasing monkeys. And Candide takes his gun and he shoots the monkeys, whereupon the women fall upon them sobbing, and his sidekick Cacambo says, "You idiot, you just killed their lovers." It's a very, very strange chapter. Immediately after that, since they're dressed as Jesuits, they are caught by a number of indigenous people who put them in a great big cauldron of water, and the indigenous people hold hands and dance around chanting, "Mangeons du Jésuite." Let's eat some Jesuit. So that's the part he read to us. He didn't read the first part of the chapter. So here you have a priest telling us to imagine this scene where other priests were being boiled for dinner. And it was too wacky, too crazy, too improbable. But to me, as a naive, very, very sheltered young man, scandalous and seductive, I wanted to read the book. However, and this is true, Candide and all of Voltaire's works were on the Roman Index of Forbidden Books. And if you read one without the written permission of your bishop, what I had been taught, and you were hit by a bus, you would burn forever in hell. And in grammar school, we were taught by the nuns to sit still and imagine every pore on our body being on fire forever. Okay. So I wrote to Bishop Flanagan in Worcester, Massachusetts, and asked for permission to read Candide, The Red and the Black, Le Rouge and le Noir, and Madame Bovary, all of which I believe were condemned. I knew that Candide was, and somehow I was told that the others were. And I got a letter from him giving me permission to do so. And later on, I went back to Holy Cross for an honorary degree, and Father Deshotel was our host for the day. And he told me that he too had asked the bishop to read to us. I mean, it's all crazy. So then I read Candide, and I suppose this is great stuff. Then I read Le Rouge et le Noir. And Julien Sorel struck me as being one of the most extraordinary figures I had ever come across. But I read them all in English, mind you. And then I read Madame Bovary, and then the point culminant, or the kind of highest end point of the whole thing, was reading Camus' book, La Peste, the Plague. And these works all changed me as a young man. Oh, it's 7 minutes already. Okay. And so I went on to do a whole lot of other things. I wrote an MA essay on Voltaire, a PhD, a doctoral dissertation on Voltaire. I was involved in the new edition of the Complete Works of Voltaire at Oxford. It took 60 years and 104 fat 500-page volumes to accomplish. The most productive writer in all of human history. Nobody ever wrote more words than Voltaire did, but they were on pen. I can't believe it. So that's my life story. And if it weren't for those translators who translated those 4 novels from French to English, more than 65 years ago. I read them 65 years ago, but they pre-existed me. And I'm sorry I didn't look up to see who they were. But translators really are the greatest people. I mean, you give us books that you don't know what kind of an impact they're going to have on people, but they can and they do. I've got the proof. I'm the proof that they change people's lives. So thank you for what you do. Congratulations, Laser. Congratulations, John. And thank you all very much.
About 10 minutes for questions. And I'll start us off with one about your experience with libraries. And you've had a lot of experience with many libraries. How did you fall in love with libraries and maybe librarians?
Well, in my world, librarians are up there with translators and with writers as being some of the greatest people around. Curiously, I wish I could say my parents took me to the local public library when I was 5 to get a library card, and that's a great, great library story that many Americans tell. I can't tell that story because where we lived in Bayside, Queens, there was no local library, at least not easily accessible to us. We went to church instead. But and then in my grammar school, there was no library either. So the first experience I had in the library was as a freshman at Holy Cross High School in Flushing. And it was a brand new school. We were the first class as freshmen. There was never anybody ahead of us, so we didn't have a normal high school experience. But there was a library on the second floor, and Brother Franciscus was a librarian. And I had never been in such a place. I mean, it was a room like this. It had bookshelves and tables to sit and read and work and so on and so forth. And I said, wow, this is like paradise. Because I shared a room with my brother. You know, I didn't have any private space of my own at home. And Brother Franciscus was a very warm, kindly man. He was probably, 28 at the time. But to me, he was like a real grown-up. And he recommended books for me to read and so on and so forth. And that was a moment, a set of experiences over 4 years that was really, really a great, great discovery for me. Then I spent a gap year in Paris, from where I applied to graduate school on the advice of the St. Jesuit. And I used to hang out at what was the Ben Franklin Library in Paris, near the Odeon, which isn't there anymore. And then I became a reader at the Bibliothèque Nationale as a young researcher, and my first library card was, I think, 1972 or so. And then I became sort of what the French call a library rat, a rat de bibliothèque. I mean, somebody who really hangs out in libraries. And I did that through my whole teaching career. At Union, I was the kind of nerdy professor that would go behind into the workspaces to see the new books as they were coming off and being put on the trolleys, that kind of stuff. And then it just continued. And you can aspire to be a college president sort of rationally, I think. You can't aspire to be the president of the New York Public Library. That's just you should be on beds if you're doing that. But one day at Union, I was walking across the campus with a colleague of mine, and he pointed out to a student who was like at the back of this room. He said, "You seen that kid?" I said, "Yes." He said, "He was my student, actually." He said, "His father's the president of the New York Public Library." I said, "Ooh." I mean, I said something a little more potent than that. But then that job came along, and it was paradise. I loved it because it was not only the research libraries, but all the libraries in Manhattan, Bronx, and Staten Island. So we were teaching English as a second language in our 3 boroughs. There was staggering amounts of money that had to be raised both publicly and privately. But I wanted to prove to the librarians that I cared about what they did, the same way when I was at Hunter, I taught elementary French at 8 in the morning section, students to know they're getting the president, but I wanted the faculty to know that I care about what they do. It's the same thing for the library. So I decided to start organizing exhibits because no president had ever done that before. And the first one was on the fables of La Fontaine. And then we did a lot of things with the Bibliothèque Nationale. Ultimately, it was the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The last of these, which I really loved, was a small exhibit marking the 250th anniversary of the publication of Candide. And if I have 1 more minute. I'm sorry. So anyway, Voltaire supervised the publication of Candide in Geneva with his favorite printer in January 1759. And the press run might have written 2,000 copies. They then sent them everywhere. They wanted them to be pirated. And 16 other editions, all with no author's name and no place of publications, were published. They included 2 in England, 1 in Italy, the Low Countries, France, and so on and so forth. So when I got to the library, we only had a copy of 1 of those 17 editions. Only 1 library in the world had all 17, and that was the Bodleian. It wasn't the French National Library. When I left, we had all 17. So in this case, we had all 17 editions, the books themselves, including the authentic first edition, as well as the manuscripts. Candide, the president of the library in France, Espoiro, and it was sensational. It was just a great show. So that anecdote about Father Desautel's reading a translation into English of a piece of fiction from 1759 carried me through decades and decades and decades of my life.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? We have a couple of minutes. Yes.
I've never read Voltaire. As someone who is a novice, what would you suggest to start with?
Well, let's start with Candide. But remember, this is not a novel. This is a philosophical tale. It's a devastating critique of philosophical optimism. The question it answers, it seeks answers, what do we do about all the evil in the world? That's the question. And it's various kinds of answers are given until it comes to the final garden, where our job is to do the work. And it's kind of like communist existentialism in a way. But there's a lot of things that people could and do find very offensive. So, but it's a satire. Remember that it's a satire. It's not the characters like 2-dimensional objects. They're like puppets. So there's never an intention to have you believe that these as real people. They stand in for points of view and so on and so forth. But I would start with that.
Follow-up would have to be which translation. Which translation would you have us read?
Oh, well, there are many. The one I used when I taught it was by Donald Frame.
Oh,
But it's pretty old.
that's a good one.
Yeah, it's a very good one. Peter Gay also translated it. Other questions?
Yes.
Have you ever read and studied Camus, Voltaire's Idée de l'Idée, and how does that compare to Thomas Merton?
Could you repeat that, please?
Have you ever read Voltaire's tract called Idée républicaine? And how does that, and if so, how would you compare that to Candide?
No, I'm afraid I haven't. I should though, shouldn't I? Yes. No, I have. I mean, his treatise on tolerance is the one that he gained great currency after the attacks in Paris, the terrorist attacks a few years ago, and that suddenly became a bestseller all over again. So that's one of the most recently familiar on that side. But thank you.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to move on. Paul Leclerc, you have proven the aptness of your name, Leclerc, the learned one.
Thank you very much.
And we'll move to the next. pleased to introduce Matt Reek, who is going to introduce our first winner of the translation prizes. Matt Reek is a poet, a literary critic, a scholar, and a translator, not only from the French, but from Hindi, Korean, and Urdu. So that's extremely impressive. He also teaches French at St. John's University. He is the recipient of many grants and fellowships and translation prizes. I could mention the Albertine Prize, which is co-sponsored by the French Embassy for his translation of Zahia Rahmani's Muslim. He also won a translation prize from Northwestern University in the Global Humanities for his translation of Abdel Kabir Khatibi's The Wound of the Name. In 2014, he was recognized by the New York Times editors for his translation of Bombay Stories by Sadat Hassan Manto. He will introduce the winner of tonight's fiction prize.
Gave her a much shorter. Laser sent me a bio this week, and I'm going to read it. Laser Lederhändler, I want to say it with the German accent, forgive me, is a veteran literary translator specializing in Quebecois fiction and nonfiction. His translations have earned awards and distinctions in Canada, UK, and USA. He has translated the works of noted authors, including Gaëtan Sucy, Nicolas Tickler, Etienne Allumé, Perrine Leblanc, Catherine Leroux, and Alain Lapierre. He has lectured in translation at the Université de Sherbrooke and Concordia University. He lives in Montreal with the visual artist Pierre Bouchard. I'm not going to get into all of the secrets of the prize committee and how it happened, but we had a lot to read. I, as a translator, know some translators and I don't know some translators. One of the reasons I wanted to do this is my first time as judge, is to learn more about who's translating today. So I got all of the documents and I read all of the translations of the people I knew first. I don't know if that was good or bad. And then I just started going through all the other stuff. Each translation had 3 samples. And I remember very clearly reading the translation, the first of Laser's. I just wanted to read a little bit. It's 5 sentences. It wasn't a good idea for Montibouche to just up and declare war on the postal service. The municipal service back then was Victor Bradley. And the municipality, well, it didn't amount to much. Not yet. A string of buildings stretched out along the coast between the sea and the forest, spilling down from a mountain teeming with game. C'est l'encelot de la Frayère, they called it. Hardwood, conifers, and telegraph poles strode down from the slope-like legs, descending into a bay speckled with as many dories as there were men living in the town. This was the Baie des Chaleurs, in the reign of Wilfrid Laurier, when the only government the locals heeded were the migrating geese and the capelins that in late June, early July, rolled stupidly onto the shore. So that really struck me. It was a place I hadn't been. The English felt entirely idiomatic. Even in the first 5 sentences of many of the submissions, which were excellent in their own ways, there were things that I wanted to change. Not that, maybe that. But there wasn't anything I wanted to change. And there was also 3 things I didn't know. I didn't know what a dory was. I didn't know what a capelin was. And when I looked at who had translated it, I didn't know who Laser was. So I started researching. And Laser's bio, in fact, is much longer than what he gave me to read. And one of the things that I found, for example, is that there is a French to English translation award in Canada called the Governor General's Literary Award, which he's won at least 3 times, 2020, 2016, 2008, and he's been a finalist 6 times. And there's another French to English translation prize, which is from the Quebec Writers Foundation, and he's won that 3 times. So I was happy to learn about a new translator, and I'm happy to introduce right now Lisa.
Thank you very much. No, translators are not used to being in the spotlight. That's one of the reasons I like you translators, like, excuse me. The weather here is it's not so good. And and I'm not used to speaking in public very often. So I'm going to read from these notes. Right, so we've been with my gratitude to the French American Foundation, to everybody involved in organizing this event, Gabrielle and Elizabeth and the others, to the jury members, to the author, because unlike others, I think, the original does matter. You can have a very good translation of a bad book, and it ends up being not a very good book. So, having a good material to translate is very important. And Christophe Bernard, the author of The Howl Beast, that was quite amazing. My publisher, Biblioasis in Windsor, Ontario, who has an office across the water in Detroit, and the editor, Dan Wells, and the publisher, Dan Wells, and my editor that I worked with on many occasions, Stephen Hennigan. And je devrais pas oublier ma conjointe, Pierrette Bouchard, ma conjointe toujours, qui est ma principale aide, support et inspiration du côté artistique. C'est elle la vraie artiste dans la maison. Chez nous. I should say that I couldn't really grasp that they were going to give this prize to. I wasn't so aware of the ins and outs of the French American Foundation. I said, well, they're not going to give this to a Canadian. It's like we're not the 51st state yet, right? So, and then I found out John Lambert is Canadian. But Claire has Canadian roots. 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, there was a Canadian winner of this prize. And what's going on? There's this Canadian connection here. And anyways, keep it a secret. Don't tell anybody in Washington about it because they make a little antsy. I'm also grateful to be here in New York. I have a very strong connection personally. I'm not going to go into details. A very strong connection personally with the city of New York and the state of New York. I spent my tender years between the ages of about 11 and 17. Every summer, I spent 2 months in upstate New York at a summer camp. My first great love interest was a New York girl who was actually born in Montreal. And so I'm very happy to be invited here and to reconnect with the city. It's very different from what it was back in the 60s and 70s, but it's still sort of pulls on my heartstrings whenever I come to New York. I'm going to read another excerpt from the one that Matt read as a way to segue into some comments. And this is, the book is very self-referential in a lot of ways, and here you go. For example, this is the story of Honoré Bouge, alias Monty, during a period riddled with blanks. later nicely filled in through the research of his grandson, Francois Bouge. When to make his fortune, ventured to a place he believed was somewhere between Baffin Island and Alaska, but found nothing save ordinary rocks and dry rabbit shit. Monty was convinced he'd arrived at the Klondike. With a margin of errors of 4,000 kilometers, give or take, he traveled for weeks, only he left after Quebec. Only after he left Quebec, he couldn't understand a word that was said to him. So when he got to the first camp, someplace east of Timmins, that's in Ontario, about 300 kilometers from Sudbury, he took a chance and decided that he'd arrived. In any case, it was just as well he stopped before the land dropped away. This then is the story of the most revealing, the most incomprehensible night of his gold rush, the story of the most decisive night of his life. From the way he would tell it later on, you knew his entire destiny depended on that round of poker. He never shared much else about his journey aside from that. So that's the summary of the main plot. There are many plots that all are weave together and come you come to a point where they sort of come together. But put it in a nutshell, I would say that I was curious about the choice of the name Honoré for the main character, because one way to summarize the whole book, in a way, is that quotation, which is the epigraph in The Godfather, Mario Puzo's epigraph, which is behind every great crime lies, behind every great fortune lies a great crime. And that is a, pardon the expression, bastardized version of a quote from Père Goriot, the Honoré de Balzac. So we have this Honoré. I think it's probably a fluke or not an intentional connection, but it is quite interesting. I just like to present one little anecdote about translating the book, the actual translation process. Translating the title is always the publisher's, in Canada at any rate, is the publisher's prerogative. They decide what the title will be. And I argued very strongly to translate La Bête Creuse without the article, because in French, La Bête Creuse could be either an adjective or it can be a verb, which would translate literally as the beast digs. I was arguing to try to retain that ambiguity by dropping the article, hollow beast. So, hollow remains in that case possibly an adjective and possibly a verb. And I was voted down by the publisher, by the author, and by his publisher. And so, okay, I give up. But in the end, they were right. In the end, they were right because by retaining the hollow beast, it more directly poses the question: what is this beast, and why is it hollow? And really, for me, that is the is the key. My reading of the beast is that the beast is not a real monster. This is my reading. Of course, translations, translators read like everybody reads. They have their own take on the original. But my reading is that the beast is a cipher. It's blank. It's hollow, a hollow space in which the characters project their dreams, their fears, their ambitions, their regrets, biases, their passions, their obsessions, their fantasies, and so forth. And I think, in these days, which are let's be frank, these are very dark and perilous times that we're in. I think it's important to realize that language actually can function like that too. Language can function like that in space. Yeah, I'm wrapping up. I'm wrapping up. And because it's sort of post-Orwellian times, language is being hollowed out, words are being hollowed out, repurposed. And I'll give you a few examples. We talk about weaponizing our language. The word, for example, human. The word woke. The word ice. The word anti-Semitism. The word Palestine. The word cleansing. The word truth. Voilà.
Where do you want to land it?
Just stand right in the middle.
This is yours.
You wanna hold it?
Oh, thank you very much.
Don't do this too quickly.
I'm gonna go right back here.
Skinny thoughts.
Works every time. All right. Yeah. 3, 2, 1. Click and click and click. Let's take a look. Mars is front and the one goes on. Also, that's great. Thank you. Thank you.
Make it that out of the way.
Yeah. Water. What's this?
So I have personally a lot of questions, but I'll limit myself to two. One about Laser and his biography, and one about the book. I think, I don't know if I can speak for you, but I wasn't born thinking I was going to be a translator. It kind of happened. Can you tell us a little bit about how that happened for you?
Yeah, I mean, I come from a family where many languages were spoken.
In the household?
In the household. My parents came over from Poland after the Second World War as immigrants to Canada. They spoke at home, we spoke Yiddish. They spoke between themselves when they didn't want the boys to understand Polish, Russian. They learned French and English in Canada.
Wow.
And so, we were immersed in many languages and going from one language to another and from one dialect. My parents spoke 2 different dialects of Yiddish. One spoke Galician Yiddish, the other spoke Lithuanian Yiddish. And we switched back and forth. But I never thought I would be a translator like yourself. And I ended up many years later, after I'd sort of moved from the English-speaking side of Montreal to the French-speaking side, and learned French and immersed myself in French language and the culture in French Quebec, French Canada. And I ended up doing community work, sort of offering my services, to translate documents from French to English and the other way around. Many years later, I ended up being a translator for the federal government, provincial government in New Brunswick. And then somebody said, well, why don't you finish your degree, which I dropped out of college. I went back to college. I finished my degree in literature. And a friend of mine said, there's somebody who wants to the book translated. You're a translator. And it went from there.
Was the lit degree in French or in English?
It was in English literature. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I mentioned this to you, and we had a previous conversation about one of the qualities of the book. I think in most, this is sort of me speaking, but also the committee speaking, that it was funny, that there was a sort of humor to it. But
Grim humor.
but what kind of humor? There's a language humor, but it's also sort of psychedelic, manic, demonic, dark. The characters, the story, the plot is that way.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a word? Did you think it was funny?
Yeah, it was funny in that way, in a sort of grim, dark humor. But sometimes, sorry, it gets very wacky and sort of slapstick. I know these young people, they get insanely drunk and stoned.
Yeah.
And then there's this drink that is a leitmotif of this drink, alcoholic drink called Yukon, which apparently is like.
Is that real?
No. No. But it inspires a lot of fantasies in the minds of the people who drink it. And so there's this kind of insane aspect to it, this kind of a lot of the language is very hyperbolic. There's a lot of hyperbole.
I was gonna say, it's like there's a hyperactivity, a hyperness of the language.
Right,
itself.
and one of the stylistic characteristics of features of the writer is that he twists languages in a way which is sort of he resists collocation.
Mhm.
He resists things that go together. He puts things together that don't go together, and it works. But it ends up being sort of funny because it ends up
Unexpected.
right, these metaphors and these images which are very strange, but at the same time sort of destabilizing and therefore funny in that way.
It's this characteristic of his writing.
Well, this is the only book, as far as I know, that he's published himself. He's a translator too.
Yeah.
Christophe Bernard lives in Vermont, by the way. And he's coming out with a new novel soon, but I guess this is his style. I mean, he insisted that I not try to imitate some kind of regional dialect from the Gaspésie.
Yeah.
That I
But like when it gets to the dialogue and some of the characters really come out, I was like, wow, this is not the French that I know. Was that when you're saying you were searching for a Gaspésie, an Eastern dialect of Quebecois, and you sort of decided not to do that? Is that also noticeable to you that it's like very regional, there are regionalisms in the language itself?
Well, there are regionalisms, there's regionalisms in terms of, I mean, I'm trying to understand what you mean by regionalism, but there's like, Montreal English.
What I think of is
Montreal
Montreal is very
French,
sophisticated,
Montreal
and
French.
you go into the countryside and things change.
Yeah, there's Montreal French, there's the French from different regions of Quebec. Which come into play, and there's Gaspésie, which has its own way of handling French language. So there are these various kinds of extensions of French out that he tries to use, but he twists them in his own way.
Questions?
Take one question from the audience.
I have a question. I see a translation as a real art, and especially for fiction. So when you begin like the book like you did, and you read it first in French, right? And then when you begin to translate, we're not using Google Translate. I think we have to capture the sense of the book, the tone, the emotions that are being explained, the characters. And I find that fascinating. How do you do that? Especially sometimes there isn't an exact translation for a sense or feeling. How do you approach that? You have to do it
slowly. It's one response, but I mean, each book has its own challenges and demands that you approach it in its own particular way. There's no one size fits all for that in terms of how you approach a book. In this book, something I actually wrote down in one of the questions that I was asked to respond to in writing in the run up to this event. In this book, it's a very visual book. I've suggested to my publisher that it could be a wonderful graphic novel, a very like insane kind of
graphic novel,
very very graphic novel. But there's this very strong visual element, and what I found was that my best avenue for the translation was to visualize the scene and then to write that scene in English, and then to check back that I was actually, not deviating or betraying that word, the original. And that worked very well for me in this case. No, but another book could be, you would have to focus not necessarily on the visual aspect, but on the sound aspect or something like that.
Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to introduce Nancy. I'm going to introduce Nancy Nyman Carlson, who's going to speak about John Lambert. Nancy won the 2022 Oxford Wiedenfeld Translation Prize. Shortlisted for the Best Translated Book Award and the Sarah Maguire Translation Prize. She was twice longlisted for the National Translation Award. Author of 16 titles, 11 translated. Her poetry and translations have been noted in the New York Times. A recipient of grants from the NEA and the Alberton Fund. She was decorated by the French government with the Academic Palms. Carlson is the translations editor for On the Seawall and the translator of When We Only Have the Earth, University of Nebraska Press, African Poetry Book Series, 2025 by the Djiboutian writer Abdulrahman Waberi. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. And when you're the last to go, you get to go, oh, should I say what I was going to say? Maybe I need to change this. So maybe I need to talk faster. Maybe I need to not read things. And then also when you're last, you go, oh, this is nice. I get to see how it's done and all. So I have 2 to 3 minutes, but I'll try to be closer to 2 minutes. And this was my first time as a juror for this prize. Thank you for choosing me. It's very exciting to see and to read. I'm a poet. Normally, I've translated fiction before, novels, but it got me to read novels. And so I was delighted that I got to read so many books that I would not have read before. So I have a bio to read. For John Lambert, our nonfiction winner. A native of Vancouver, John Lambert has translated Monsieur Reticence and Self-Portrait Abroad by Jean-Philippe Toussaint, Change and Monique Escapes, forthcoming by Edouard Louis, as well as Emmanuel Carrère's Limonov. The Kingdom, 196 words, and Yoga. He lives in Nantes with his wife and family in northwestern France. And actually his son Deo is here with him, taking advantage of this prize to see the city for 5 days. And then Deo is going back to train as a gendarme. So it's nice to have family here too for this award. And this book, B13, Chronicle of a Trial, it's a chronicle of one of France's largest trials in history. There were 2,400 plaintiffs, 14 defendants, and it details in very specific graphic detail the Bataclan terrorist attacks in Paris that took place in 2015 and elsewhere in Paris during that time or that day. And it talks about the lives of not only the victims and the survivors and the gendarmes who came, but also of the defendants themselves. And what is memorable is that the father of a terrorist and the father of a victim both became, it seemed to me, friends, and they both wrote books about this event. So this brilliant translation was especially able to capture the tone of the original. The tone has, I like Laser, you're talking about a grim, dark tone. And this one is not as funny as some of the parts of the Hollow Beast. But there were moments, many moments, of looking at it, a journalist watching all of this unfold for all these months. I mean, over 10 months of trial. And what stuck in my mind was, in the middle of all this, there's a description of Freud's copper kettle. And it tells a story about how a man borrows a copper kettle and then he returns it back and there's a hole in it. And so when asked about it, he's sued and he maintains three things. He says the kettle isn't damaged. He says the kettle was already damaged when he got it. And then the third, he never borrowed the kettle. And I think using that was a description of one of the defendants who was giving an alibi for what happened there. I think in the midst of some descriptions of beheadings of what the terrorists watched, and then the actual massacre in the concert hall with the doors locked. I think what helps us find a raft in all this is this humanity that is in the waves there, in that raft there. So if you have not read this book, I should recommend it to read. So I think we have the award for you. And you get to come up.
We get a round of applause for our.
I'm sorry, touch that award. Just let him touch it.
It looks like in the picture. Yeah, you can both hold it.
You can hold it.
It's like you're giving it to.
Because otherwise, what am I gonna do with?
3, 2, 1, right here. Let's take a look.
Without the glasses?
Well, then I'm gonna take that. I'll keep by.
And 3, 2, 1, click. 3, 2, 1, click. One horizontal. 3, 2, 1, click, and you guys are golden.
Merci. Thank you. I'm going to clear this here. We didn't budget in time for this.
I mean, I think that is cute and have a drink.
This is really fun. Thank you very much. Thank you to the members of the foundation, and thank you also to the jurors. It's not an easy job, and I was delighted to talk to you about what you did. It's just a huge amount of work that you did, and I'm thrilled to be standing here today. Before I start, I want to come up first of all to come back on a word that Lazarus said, which is that we've got 2 Canadians here winning this prize. It's true, I'm Canadian, Leo's Canadian, and we're spending 5 wonderful days here, sort of leading up to this the summit in New York. But we're also French, so it's not just Canadians, you got French people here. So I'd also like to refer to a word that Paul said, because I really appreciated hearing about Candide. And as you were talking, I have to get on my phone now. I wrote something down that you said. Because I realized that, in fact, in a lot of ways, what Carrère is dealing with, and what is similar to what Candide is dealing with, especially as you put it, which is how do we deal with what do we do with the evil in this world? And that's like a major theme that runs through this book, which I'm going to repeat. Nancy and Naomi, read it, buy it, read it. It's a great read. And this is really what the book deals with, it not only in personal terms, on very, very many levels. Carrère sits through 10, 11 months of this trial and gets to know people and tells us about them in such a personal way, but also in a national sense. It's how a nation deals with evil, with being struck to the core by an evil event. And ultimately, a lot was awaited, was expected from this trial, but ultimately what happens is something, a sort of a catharsis that comes out in this trial, and that's also a really wonderful moment. If you allow me, I'm going to come back to what I jotted down. Some of you may remember this is in fact the second time I've been named as a finalist. The first time being 10 years ago for Emmanuel Carrère's Limonov. That year I was awarded an honorary mention, and I'm thrilled that this year we can convert that field goal with a touchdown. When I was asked to say a few words this evening, I wrote to a couple of people to see if there was something I could put in for them. I'm lucky. I have not only one team of editors, but I have two, which I'm sure made my translation of this book at least twice as good as it was when I submitted it. Most of those present, or a lot of those present who work in books, know the drill. Once you've submitted the manuscript, there's a first read by the editors, and then there's the first pass, and the questions having to do with the first pass. And there's a second pass, and the questions that have to do with the third pass. And then the book goes to proofreaders, and then finally, right at the very end, there's some bright person says, well, wait a second, shouldn't we spelling, as with 10 years ago with the book Limonov, shouldn't we spelling his first name Edouard, like in French, instead of Edward? It's this very basic thing that's being asked right at the very end. Like, yes, good, thank you. So writing back, Mitzi Angel, who's not here tonight, president of Forest, Strauss and Giroux, you're going to have to bear with me. I said she should write it whatever she wants. She wrote this. She said, John, you brought the work of one of France's greatest writers to the English language readers and translations that are as distinctive and sharp as Carrère's own books. I'm thrilled to see you recognized with this honor. For her part, Michelle Chavit, who I work with in London, she's the publishing director of Fern Press, says, translation is a human art. It requires emotional intelligence and ability to hear the style, tone, and rhythm of the author's words on the page. And you nailed that, John. When I got that, I wrote back and said, Michelle, we're going to need a big joke after that. Luckily, the author, Emmanuel Carrère, came through. He writes, a French critic once wrote that Lovecraft's style benefited from being translated into French. I hope I don't deserve, Carrère goes on, such a backhanded compliment, but I know that being translated in English by John Lambert is one of the joys of my life as a writer. What's more, he also gives me the joy of collaborating with him. Carrère goes on, in fact, we've developed a simple technique. He sends me 50-page sections to which I respond, clarify, make suggestions, sometimes express doubts. Often he agrees with me. Sometimes he doesn't. I love this teamwork. I love seeing each new book take shape. And I know, John, that you're going to tackle my next book called Cuz, which comes out this fall. I can't wait to see the first 50 pages. I was in Paris 2 weeks ago, actually to see my daughter in a play. And when I was there, I asked Emmanuel if I could meet with them, so he could share some words about this ceremony then. And he wasn't able to. But I did manage to have a coffee with Arthur Desnouveaux, who is an author and president of the association Life for Paris, which represents the victims of the November 15 Paris attacks. when I was talking to him, I saw how crucial the trial from September 2021 to June 2022 was. Arthur was at the Bataclan, and it's with an amazing calm that he describes the micro decisions, lingering at the bar, not going to the bathroom, that led to him being alive today. He was thrown to the ground, crawled to the exit leading to the back lane, where he himself put the frantic members of the group Eagles of Death Metal, who had played that night, into a taxi and saw them off. It was a long process for him, he said, but unlike many who burned out, he was able to continue and preside the association. On the upcoming 10th anniversary of the attacks this November 13th, together with President Emmanuel Macron and Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo, he will inaugurate the Memory Garden in Paris, commemorating the victims. On that day, and this is what I was getting at, the members will collectively disband Life for Paris. They will stop being victims. And also, thanks to this trial, Arthur says, he will finally be able to talk to his daughters, who are now 1, 3, and 6, about what happened. As for myself, there's just so much in this book that it's I really don't know where to start, but perhaps this evening I can start at the end. When I got there, when I finished the translation, I read the last chapter to my wife and my daughter in the kitchen. And I'd like to read the end of that chapter to you now. Four years later, Nadia sat alone for a long time in the place where they had sat together for a long time, in Cairo. She listened to the cries of Allah Akbar rising from the huge swarming city and their echo in the golden sky. Policemen came up to her to tell her that the park was closing. Nadia wanted to stay a little longer. The policeman insisted, but instead of obeying, she started to tell him in Arabic what had happened. Words came to her naturally, calmly. And as she spoke, she understood that it was essential, that it was the most important thing she could do, to tell this story in Arabic to an unknown Egyptian policeman. The policeman understood this too. At the end of the story, he said to Nadia, "Your daughter and the others are shahid, martyrs." And you hear from the mouth of this Egyptian policeman that they were the martyrs, and not the killers who attributed this dignity to themselves from the depth of their ignorance. It was as if the world was falling back into place. Thank you.
Now we come to the Q&A. And we're also looking at the approaching hour. So 2 questions. None from the audience. How about 1 question from me and 1 from the audience? Or 2 from
New one from the office, I think we'll be good.
So John, you have set the bar for me because I gave you a whole list of questions, like 6 of them, 7 of them, and then you said, or surprise you. So I can't help but surprise you. And as translators, and I love it that we're so many of us translators here in this room and really get into whether it's the Hollow Beast or it's the just plain Hollow Beast. And here your name is on the cover. Not all translators have the translator's name on the cover. So I wanted to ask you about your role as a translator vis-a-vis the author. And as you are working with the author, can you tell us if when you read passages and you're translating them, what goes through your mind as far as where you go, wait, that doesn't make sense when I'm reading in the French, and should that be clearer? Or do you just go with it because that's your translator and you have your place there?
That's a good question. It's a cruel question. for me and my work with Carrère, I'm lucky in that I've translated, Lazarus got this whole list of great authors that he deals with. I consider myself lucky because I take the books that come along, and I started off translating Jean-Philippe Toussaint and then went right on with Carrère, and those are really the only two authors I've translated. I've done 5 books by Carrère now, and to answer your question, he's really not an easy guy to translate because some people sort of associate him with gonzo journalism, sorry, in that he takes a sort of fast and loose attitude to what he's writing sometimes, and it's very challenging for me. I've written about this to adequately render what he's doing, because he can, for example, quote Freud, and Freud never said what he said Freud said. It's the same thing with Kafka, and it's just not. But Kafka was great because I went back and looked at the German and said, that's actually not what he says. And he said, John, just keep it the way I write it. That's what I wrote. And so this is ongoing. When I translated The Kingdom, it was, and not only myself, but a lot of translators. He sent me, Emmanuel, the author, sent me the questions that were asked by the Italian translator, which of course, it's a book about Christianity. The Italians, see 5 pages or more of really detailed questions and their answers. So everybody has to deal with this, but you're constantly checking back and forth. But just to end, we have this great relationship, and I like working with him. He likes working with me, and when I go to Paris, I see him, and we sort of kick around, go out to lunch, and each book is something that we do together, and that's really why I wanted to talk about the editors too, because this is it's a team effort, and Emmanuel is definitely part of the team.
Thank you. And then that initial meeting with him where you read his work, how did it come about that you translated that first book? And I don't think you shared that.
No, I didn't. It was someone from FSG is here tonight, Forrest Justin Drew, I believe. I don't know if Ian has left yet, but it was an editor from FSG, Jesse Coleman. He's no longer working with them, but he said he'd written the translations that I had done of Jean-Philippe stuff, and he said, this is the guy who should do it, and so I've stayed with the FSG and with Carrère ever since. Yeah, it's good.
And that's translators. Many of them dream of that the publishers come to them and say, "Well, you can translate this book." And we could talk forever on that topic too. But that's wonderful that is happening. Do we have a question? Yes.
John, you and I are both translated works of Horrible Atrocity. And I would like to hear your experience, how you cope with the emotions involved in translating that kind of material.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. Can you remind me of your name?
Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff. Yeah. Jeff is a finalist, and was good enough to come. I was just thinking, this is what we had talked about this question too, and it's really, really important. And it's a very strange thing. You cannot help but try to do your best when you're translating this stuff, and you cannot help but be proud of what you're translating. And the better it is, the prouder you are. And it's not easy at all, especially when you're dealing with something that is what, there are parts of V13 that are great and that are funny and that are very moving. Like I find this last bit, but there are parts that are extremely difficult. And Carrère says, I'm not somebody who cries a lot, but I go home and I cry. And for me too, it's it's extremely tough. But I think that Carrère does it in a good way, and he doesn't, he's not afraid to put the reader in a really uncomfortable situation. He's not afraid to make you feel uncomfortable, but at the same time, he's also very readable. But I think that, it just reminds me of when I translated an article on Hiroshima that quite a while ago, and I mean, it was just appalling what I had to translate, but every time I read it, I liked it more and more, and it's a very strange thing that we deal with.
I guess our time is up, but thank you, John.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
On behalf of the foundation and the jurors, I'd like to announce the names of the finalists, 4 in each category. And thank you, Jeffrey Zuckerman, for being here. Yeah. In the category of fiction, Ruth Diver translated Sharif Majdelani's A History of the Big House. Jordan Stump translated Rebecca Gisler's About Uncle. Jeffrey Zuckerman, Adele Rosenfeld's Jellyfish Have No Ears. Akhil Gope and Jeffrey Dietermann. Excuse me. Louis Timashen Watts, The Maroons. In the nonfiction category, Corey Stockwell translated Jean-Luc Nancy's A City in the Distance. Nicholas Elliott translated Simone Weil's Life in Letters, her correspondence. Stéphanie Boulard and Timothy Lavence translated Pascal Quinault's The Answer to Lord Chandos, and Alison Strayer translated Annie Ernaux's The Use of Photography, and you see most of those books on the table if you'd like to see them.
Thank you for coming up and also introducing all of us to the finalists as well. It's a wonderful selection back there. Check it out. Congratulations to both of you. It's been a joyous evening. Thank you for being here. Enjoy your Thanksgiving. That's okay. Thank you so much. That's okay. Stay close to the front.